The steel target stood at 3,500 meters. An impossible distance that had humbled countless marksmen before. No human alive can hit that consistently, Sergeant Major Thaddeus Blackwood declared to his assembled trainees, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades training the military's deadliest snipers. His weather-beaten face cracked into the kind of smirk that had intimidated generations of soldiers. 20 elite marksmen sat in perfect rows before him, nodding in agreement as the morning desert sun beat down on the Kadara Special Operations Training Facility. The heat mirage already beginning to dance across the valley floor made the distant steel plate shimmer like a phantom. No one noticed the lone figure on the distant ridge, 4,000 meters away, setting up with the methodical precision of someone who had performed this ritual in far more hostile environments. Her movements were economical, practiced, deadly. In the moment between Blackwood's confident smirk and his next breath, the impossible happened. The target exploded into fragments with a metallic crack that echoed across the valley like thunder. Confusion rippled through the group of elite soldiers like a shockwave. They hadn't even heard a shot. 3 seconds later, the time it took for sound to travel that impossible distance, the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle rolled across the training ground like the voice of judgment itself. Blackwood's face drained of all color as recognition dawned. His hands began to tremble almost imperceptibly. In a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke the words that would unravel 3 years of carefully constructed lies. "She's back." Before we dive into this extraordinary story of betrayal, justice, and the impossible shot that changed everything, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, from which city around the world are you watching this video today? Are you in New York, London, Tokyo, or perhaps somewhere I've never heard of? Your stories from around the globe help make our community of legend seekers truly special. And if you believe that stories like this, tales of silent courage and delayed justice, deserve to be remembered and shared, please subscribe to Silent Legends. Hit that notification bell, because we're about to witness how one woman's 3-year quest for truth culminated in a single, perfect moment of reckoning. This is Silent Legends, where we honor the quiet heroes whose stories time forgot, but history never will. The morning sun sliced across the Kadara Special Operations Training Facility like a blade, illuminating millions of dust particles suspended in the desert air. The facility sprawled across 50,000 acres of Nevada wasteland, a testament to America's commitment to training the world's most lethal long-range specialists. Sergeant Major Thaddeus Blackwood stood before his latest class like a monument to military precision. At 58, his uniform bore the kind of ribbons and badges that told stories of 3 decades spent in the world's most dangerous places. The Distinguished Service Cross gleamed on his chest, flanked by campaign ribbons from Iraq, Afghanistan, and conflicts so classified they didn't officially exist. His weather-beaten face bore the hallmarks of a life lived in harsh environments, deep lines carved by desert sun and mountain wind, eyes that had seen too much, hands that never quite stopped moving, always checking, always ready. He was, by every metric that mattered, the most successful sniper instructor in the program's history. "Gentlemen," Blackwood announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He paced before his trainees with deliberate steps that kicked up small clouds of dust, each footfall measured and precise. "Today, we separate the legends from the liars. Today, you learn the difference between confidence and arrogance, between skill and luck." The 20 men before him represented the elite of the elite. Each had already survived months of preliminary selection, psychological evaluation, and basic marksmanship training. They were Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, Air Force Special Operations, the best their respective services had to offer. And yet, as Blackwood surveyed them with those calculating eyes, he knew that most would fail to meet his standards. "Every marksman thinks they're special until they meet the impossible," Blackwood continued, his weathered face cracking into that signature smirk that had become legend among trainees. "Every shooter believes they can make the shot that physics says cannot be made. That's why that steel plate exists." He gestured with a sweep of his arm toward a distant speck barely visible on the mountainside, shimmering in the heat mirage at exactly 3,500 meters. Most of the trainees had to squint and strain to even locate the target with their naked eyes, despite being equipped with the finest optics military science could provide. At this range, Blackwood explained, beginning what he called his reality sermon, "You're not just fighting distance. You're fighting wind shear at multiple elevations. Temperature gradients that change by the minute. Humidity variations. Barometric pressure. The Coriolis effect from the Earth's rotation. Spin drift. Mirage distortion. And that's assuming your equipment is perfect, your calculations are flawless, and Lady Luck happens to be smiling." He paused for effect, watching as several trainees unconsciously leaned forward, hanging on his every word. "Physics doesn't care about your ego, gentlemen. It doesn't care about your service record or your previous achievements. That target at 3,500 meters, we call it, the Humbler, exists to remind you that some things remain beyond human capability, no matter what fairy tales you've heard." The trainees nodded solemnly, absorbing the lesson with the seriousness of men whose lives would depend on understanding their limitations. All except one. In the back row, sitting with perfect posture that somehow managed to suggest both military discipline and coiled readiness, Lieutenant Aviva Nicks remained motionless. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it might have been painted on, and unlike the others who leaned forward eagerly to catch every word, she sat as still as a statue. Where the other trainees wore standard-issue gear fresh from supply, Nicks' equipment told a different story. Her rifle case bore the subtle scars of use in sandy environments. Her boots showed the kind of wear that spoke of thousands of miles on hostile ground. Her tactical vest had been modified in ways that suggested experience with unconventional operations. Most telling of all were her eyes, hidden behind specialized ballistic sunglasses that seemed to catalog and assess everything in her field of view. When Blackwood called for volunteers at various ranges, 800 meters, 1,200 meters, 1,500 meters, her hand would raise slightly, a minimal movement that somehow conveyed both confidence and restraint. But Blackwood's gaze deliberately swept past her as though she were invisible, as though she didn't exist at all. From an elevated observation post 500 meters away, Captain Lazaro Reyes watched the proceedings through high-powered binoculars. At 42, Reyes had the kind of military bearing that suggested a career spent in special operations, but his posture stiffened noticeably when his optics found Lieutenant Nicks among the assembled trainees. His hand moved instinctively to the secure satellite phone clipped to his belt, fingers dancing over the encrypted keypad with practiced efficiency. The call connected immediately, routed through multiple relay points to obscure its origin and destination. "Sir, we have a situation," Reyes said quietly, his voice barely audible even to himself. "She's here. At the facility. Among the trainees." The voice on the other end was calm, controlled, but Reyes could detect the underlying tension. A single question was asked, and Reyes glanced back toward the training ground where Nicks sat motionless among her peers. "Yes, sir." Confirmed visual on Lieutenant Aviva Nicks. "She's using her own name, her own ID. No attempt at concealment." He paused, watching as Blackwood began his first live-fire demonstration. "What are your orders?" The response was brief, decisive. Reyes nodded once and terminated the connection, but his eyes never left the figure of Aviva Nicks. After a moment, he raised the binoculars again, this time scanning the distant ridges that surrounded the training facility. The morning progressed with mechanical precision as one by one, Blackwood's elite trainees attempted their shots at progressively challenging distances. At 800 meters, most managed respectable groupings. At 1,200 meters, the groups began to spread, confidence wavering as environmental factors began to assert themselves. By 1,500 meters, only half the class was still hitting the target consistently, and Blackwood's commentary grew increasingly pointed with each failure. "This, gentlemen, is why we train," he announced after a particularly poor shot scattered 3 inches off-center. "Not to feed your egos with impossible dreams, but to teach you reliable, repeatable performance under stress. In the field, you don't get style points for attempting shots you can't make. You get body bags. His voice carried the cold authority of experience as he continued his lecture. Some of you came here believing the Hollywood myths about super snipers making magical shots at impossible ranges. Let me be clear, that's fantasy. In the real world, you know your limitations, you stay within them, and you call for air support when the target is beyond your capabilities. Specialist Talon Merrick, a lean, observant soldier with piercing hazel eyes and the quiet demeanor of someone accustomed to watching rather than speaking, noticed when Lieutenant Nicks quietly gathered her equipment during a brief rest period. While the other trainees clustered around Blackwood for individual coaching, she moved with purposeful efficiency toward the perimeter of the training area. Merrick had developed exceptional situational awareness during his 3 years in Army Special Forces, and something about Nick's movement pattern triggered his instincts. She didn't walk like someone taking a bathroom break or seeking shade. She walked like someone with a specific objective and a limited window to achieve it. Her gait was economical, practiced, completely silent despite the loose gravel underfoot. Every step seemed calculated to minimize her visual signature against the desert background. Within moments, she had disappeared into the heat shimmer and broken terrain that surrounded the facility. As Nicks moved across the training facility's perimeter, memories flashed through her mind like fragments of a nightmare that refused to fade. A sterile conference room where 3-star generals had read prepared statements denouncing her leadership. The sound of her medals being placed one by one into a manila envelope, each clink echoing like a gunshot. Newspaper headlines that had branded her a failure: Special Forces mission ends in disaster. 5 dead in botched operation. Lieutenant under investigation for operational security breach. The worst memory of all, 5 flag-draped coffins arranged in perfect formation at Dover Air Force Base, while she stood at attention knowing that the families of those good soldiers had been told their loved ones died because of her failures. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as these images cycled through her consciousness, fueling the cold determination that had sustained her through 3 years of exile, disgrace, and preparation for this moment. 4,000 meters from the training ground, at an elevation that provided clear sight lines to both the facility and the impossible target, Nicks established her firing position with the methodical precision of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times in environments far more hostile than the Nevada desert. The ridge was perfect for her purposes, high enough to provide clear lines of sight, rocky enough to provide natural concealment, and positioned so that the morning sun would be at her back rather than in her eyes. Every detail had been calculated, every variable accounted for. From a battered rifle case that bore the partially scratched-off markings of foreign military units, she began removing components of what appeared to be a standard American military rifle but was, in fact, something far more sophisticated. The weapon had been custom-built over 3 years, using specialized components sourced from manufacturers across 3 continents. The barrel was German precision engineering, crafted to tolerances measured in fractions of thousandths of an inch. The action was Swiss, built to withstand temperature extremes and maintain accuracy under conditions that would destroy lesser weapons. The scope was Israeli, incorporating technology that remained classified in most military circles. She assembled the weapon with the fluid efficiency of someone who could perform the task blindfolded, in darkness, under enemy fire. Each component clicked into place with the satisfaction of precision engineering meeting expert hands. Through her high-powered spotting scope, Nicks observed the training session continuing below. Blackwood was in his element, gesturing dramatically toward the impossible target while trainees struggled with much more achievable distances. His performance was flawless, the confident instructor, the voice of experience, the man whose word was law in this small corner of the military universe. But Nicks knew what the trainees didn't. She knew about the encrypted communications with foreign operatives. The offshore bank accounts. The detailed operational intelligence that had somehow found its way into enemy hands just hours before Operation Shadowfall. Captain Reyes continued his surveillance from the observation post, phone pressed to his ear in an ongoing conversation with unseen superiors. His agitation was becoming more pronounced with each passing minute, evident in the way he paced back and forth across the small platform. "Sir, I strongly recommend we evacuate the training area," Reyes was saying, his voice tight with stress. Given her capabilities, given what she accomplished during Shadowfall before everything went sideways, we have to assume she's planning something significant. The response from his superior was apparently not what he wanted to hear, because his shoulders sagged slightly. Understood, sir. But if she's here for Blackwood, if she's figured out what really happened 3 years ago. He trailed off as another voice joined the conversation, someone with enough authority to end the debate with a few terse sentences. Reyes's posture straightened immediately, the body language of a soldier receiving direct orders. Yes, sir. I understand. Maintain observation, do not interfere unless specifically ordered. The asset is to be allowed to proceed unless she threatens civilian personnel. As he terminated the call, Reyes realized that he was no longer observing a training exercise. He was witnessing the opening moves of an operation that had been 3 years in the making. Back on the distant ridge, Nicks was entering the zone that every elite marksman knew but few could achieve, the state of perfect fusion between shooter, weapon, and target. Her breathing slowed to the precise rhythm she had practiced 10,000 times, 4 seconds in, hold for 4 seconds out. Her heart rate decreased through conscious control to 40 beats per minute. She began her calculations, factoring variables that most snipers never even considered. Wind speed and direction were measured not just at ground level, but estimated at multiple elevations between her position and the target. Temperature gradients created by the heating desert floor would affect bullet trajectory in ways that required intuitive understanding born of experience. The Coriolis effect, the influence of the Earth's rotation on a projectile traveling over such an extreme distance, had to be calculated and compensated for. At 3,500 meters, even the spin drift of the bullet as it rotated through the air would have a measurable impact on point of impact. But the most challenging variable was the heat mirage itself. The target occasionally disappeared entirely behind walls of superheated air rising from the valley floor, requiring not just perfect timing but an almost supernatural ability to read the rhythms of the desert atmosphere. Specialist Merrick, having completed his assigned shooting positions, had quietly moved to an observation point that allowed him to scan the surrounding ridges. His instincts were telling him that something was happening beyond the scope of the scheduled training, and years of combat experience had taught him to trust those instincts. For several minutes, he methodically glassed the high ground around the facility, looking for anything that seemed out of place. Most of his sweep revealed nothing but empty desert, broken rock, and the occasional desert wildlife. Then, for just a moment, sunlight reflected off something on the distant ridge. It was barely a glint, gone almost before it registered, but it was enough. Someone was up there with optical equipment, and they were watching the training facility. Merrick lowered his binoculars and considered his options. Protocol dictated that he report the observation immediately. But something held him back, perhaps curiosity, perhaps the soldier's instinct that sometimes it was better to observe and understand before acting. Down on the training ground, Blackwood was building toward the climax of his morning presentation. He had gathered his trainees around him in a loose semicircle, positioning himself so that the impossible target was visible in the background, a tiny speck against the mountainside. Some of you have heard stories, he began, his voice taking on the tone of someone debunking cherished myths. Legends about shooters who could make hits at ranges that defy the laws of physics. Tales of a sniper they called Ghost, who supposedly made confirmed kills at distances that would make today's demonstration look like close-range work. A few of the trainees exchanged glances. The legend of Ghost was indeed known in special operations circles, whispered stories of impossible shots made in impossible conditions, of a sniper so skilled that enemy forces had placed bounties on her head that reached into 7 figures. Let me be absolutely clear about something, Blackwood continued, his voice growing more emphatic. Those stories are fairy tales. Morale boosters cooked up by intelligence officers to make us feel better about our capabilities. No human being, no matter how skilled, no matter how well equipped, can consistently make kills at extreme range under field conditions. He gestured toward the distant target with theatrical dismissal. That steel plate at 3,500 meters represents the absolute theoretical limit of human marksmanship under perfect conditions: no wind, no mirage, no stress, unlimited time to prepare. Even then, success would be maybe 1 shot in 10 for the very best shooter in the world. What Blackwood didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that at that very moment, 4,000 meters away, Lieutenant Aviva Nicks was making final adjustments to her scope and rifle configuration. She had spent the last 20 minutes reading wind patterns by watching the movement of dust and debris across multiple elevation levels. She had calculated temperature gradients by observing the behavior of heat mirage at different altitudes. Most importantly, she had used her spotting scope to observe Blackwood himself, watching as he paced back and forth in front of his trainees, noting his movement patterns, timing his gestures, calculating the precise moment when he would be standing in perfect alignment with the distant target. As she worked, her fingers occasionally traced 5 names etched into the custom stock of her rifle, names that most of the military world believed had died because of her failures as a commander: Rodriguez, Chen, Washington, Kowalski, and Patel. Call signs: Viper, Phoenix, Eagle, Bear, and Falcon. The memory surfaced unbidden, as it always did during moments of intense concentration. Night vision goggles revealing a compound that didn't match their intelligence briefings. Buildings in the wrong locations, guard patterns that suggested someone had warned the enemy of their approach. The moment when her point man, Rodriguez, had looked back at her with recognition in his eyes, not the recognition of a target, but the recognition of a trap. The desperate radio calls for extraction that met only static. The sound of her team's voices growing fainter as they fought a running battle against overwhelming odds. "They told us it was a rescue mission," she whispered to herself, adjusting her rifle's elevation knob with microscopic precision. "But we were never meant to come back, were we?" The question was directed at Captain Reyes, whose image was currently centered in her spotting scope as he continued his surveillance from the observation post. She had known, even before the evidence arrived, that there had been more to Operation Shadowfall's failure than simple intelligence mistakes. Good soldiers didn't die because of bad luck. They died because someone had betrayed them. A black SUV with government plates appeared on the access road leading to the training facility, approaching at high speed and kicking up a dust plume visible for miles. Through her spotting scope, Nicks could see that it was an official vehicle, the kind used for transporting high-ranking officers who needed to travel without advance notice. The SUV pulled to a stop at the edge of the training area, and Nicks felt her breath catch as she recognized the tall, distinguished figure who emerged from the passenger seat. General Harrison Hargrove, head of Special Operations Command, flanked by 2 serious-looking aides carrying secure communication equipment and classified document cases. Hargrove's presence changed everything. He wasn't here for a routine inspection or ceremonial visit. He was here because someone with sufficient authority had ordered him to be here, at this specific time, at this specific place. As Nicks watched, Reyes quickly descended from his observation post and moved to greet the general. Their conversation was brief, intense, and conducted with the kind of body language that suggested both urgency and extreme sensitivity. Down on the training ground, Blackwood remained oblivious to the arrival of his superior officers, continuing his lecture about the impossibility of extreme-range marksmanship. "Trust the science, gentlemen. Trust your training. And never, ever bet lives on myths and legends. That's the difference between professionals and amateurs. We know our limitations, and we stay within them." The irony was not lost on Aviva Nicks as she entered the final phase of her preparation. For 3 years, she had been forced to live within the limitations imposed by others, stripped of rank, denied access to equipment, treated as a failed officer whose career had ended in disgrace. But today, she would demonstrate that some limitations exist only in the minds of those who lack the skill, the dedication, and the moral purpose to transcend them. Her breathing slowed even further as she settled into position behind the rifle, her body becoming one with the weapon and the earth beneath her. The world around her faded away until there existed only 3 points in space: herself, the rifle, and the distant target that had been placed there as a symbol of the impossible. She closed her eyes briefly and went through her final mental checklist. Wind speed steady at 8 miles per hour from the northwest, with upper-level variations compensated for. Temperature 94 degrees Fahrenheit and rising, with heat mirage patterns cycling every 47 seconds. Barometric pressure steady at 30.15 inches of mercury. Range to target, exactly 3,500 meters, confirmed by laser rangefinder. Bullet drop at this distance would be significant, over 40 feet, but she had calculated the precise scope adjustment needed to compensate. The Coriolis effect would push the projectile approximately 6 inches to the right, requiring a corresponding adjustment. Most challenging of all was the timing. The target would only be clearly visible for brief moments between heat mirage cycles, requiring her to coordinate her shot with the rhythm of the desert atmosphere itself. She opened her eyes and acquired the target through her scope. The steel plate swam in and out of focus as heat waves distorted the air between her position and the mountainside. She would have perhaps a 3-second window when conditions would be optimal. 2 seconds. 1 second. Now, Aviva Nicks took her final breath, held it at the precise moment between heartbeats when her body was most still, and squeezed the trigger with the kind of pressure that comes only from years of perfect practice. The rifle discharged with a sound like controlled thunder, the recoil absorbed efficiently by her positioning and the weapon's custom-designed muzzle brake. Through her scope, she tracked the bullet's path as it began its journey across the valley, a tiny projectile carrying 3 years of determination across 3,500 meters of hostile physics. At the training ground, Sergeant Major Blackwood was in the middle of explaining why extreme-range shots were the domain of Hollywood fiction rather than military reality when the impossible happened. The steel target at 3,500 meters exploded. Not struck, obliterated. The plate shattered into fragments that sparkled in the morning sunlight as they scattered across the mountainside. The sound of impact echoed across the valley like a gunshot, which, of course, it was, though few of the observers immediately made that connection. For a moment that stretched like eternity, confused silence fell over the training ground. The 20 elite soldiers looked around in bewilderment, their minds struggling to process what they had witnessed. No one had fired. They hadn't even heard a gunshot. Several trainees instinctively began scanning the surrounding ridges, their training kicking in as they searched for threats. Others dropped to prone positions, seeking cover from an unknown sniper. A few simply stood frozen, unable to reconcile what they had seen with what they believed to be possible. 3 seconds later, exactly the time required for sound to travel 3,500 meters at sea level, the distinctive boom of a high-powered rifle rolled across the training ground like the voice of judgment itself. Blackwood stood motionless in the center of the chaos, his face cycling through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, naked fear. His hands began to tremble as the full implications of what had just occurred registered in his consciousness. In a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke the words that would end his career and quite possibly his life: "She's back." Captain Reyes was already in motion, his secure phone pressed to his ear as he barked orders for immediate lockdown procedures. "All units, this is Control. We have an active sniper situation. Unknown shooter, extreme range capability demonstrated. Lock down the facility immediately." But General Hargrove raised his hand in a gesture that immediately halted all movement. His voice carried the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Delay that order, Captain. Stand down all security personnel. No one is in danger here." The general's calm demeanor in the face of what appeared to be a sniper attack was jarring. As his aides distributed sealed folders to the senior personnel present, Hargrove's expression remained composed, almost expectant. "Sir," Blackwood finally managed, his voice cracking slightly, "we have an unknown shooter with capabilities beyond anything I've ever witnessed. We need to implement immediate security protocols and call in a quick reaction force." "The shooter isn't unknown to me, Sergeant Major," Hargrove replied, his tone suggesting that this conversation had been anticipated. "And after you review the contents of that folder, she won't be unknown to you either." Blackwood's hands shook as he opened the classified document case that had been placed in front of him. The other senior instructors did likewise, their expressions changing from confusion to shock to dismay as they absorbed the contents. Security camera footage showed Blackwood meeting with individuals identified as foreign intelligence operatives. Financial records detailed a series of wire transfers to offshore accounts in his name. Communication logs revealed classified operational details being transmitted through encrypted channels during the weeks leading up to Operation Shadowfall. Most damning of all was an audio recording, crystal clear despite having been captured by long-range surveillance equipment, Blackwood's voice providing detailed information about the planned insertion route, timing, and personnel composition of the mission that had resulted in 5 deaths. 3 years ago, General Hargrove began, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent training ground. A classified operation codenamed Shadowfall was compromised by someone within this command structure. 5 of our finest operators died in what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated ambush. 1 member of the team survived. Blackwood made a desperate lunge toward his sidearm, but before his hand could reach the weapon, a red laser dot appeared precisely centered on his chest. The dot was rock-steady, controlled by someone with the kind of marksmanship skills that had just been demonstrated at extreme range. "I wouldn't recommend that course of action," General Hargrove said calmly. "Lieutenant Nicks has already demonstrated her capabilities today. I suspect she has at least 2 more rounds loaded and a clear sight picture." 2 military police officers approached from the facility's security building, moving with the confident steps of men following predetermined orders. They positioned themselves on either side of Blackwood, who stood rigid with a mixture of fury and terror. "Sir," Specialist Merrick asked quietly, having moved closer to the general during the unfolding drama, "who is Lieutenant Nicks?" General Hargrove turned to address not just Merrick, but all of the assembled trainees. Lieutenant Aviva Nicks was, until 3 years ago, the most decorated marksman in Special Operations history. She held records for confirmed kills at extreme range that remain unbroken. Her tactical brilliance and leadership skills made her one of our most valuable assets. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the group. She was also the commanding officer of the team that walked into the Shadowfall ambush. When she returned as the sole survivor, rather than receiving proper medical treatment and recognition for her extraordinary efforts to save her teammates, she was accused of operational negligence and betrayal. The general's voice hardened as he continued. Evidence was fabricated. Witnesses were coached. Her security clearance was revoked, her medals stripped, her career destroyed. She became a scapegoat for what was, in fact, an act of treason committed by the very man who had trained her. A transport helicopter appeared over the ridge where Nicks had positioned herself, its rotors beating a steady rhythm that echoed across the valley. As the assembled soldiers watched, the aircraft touched down briefly in a cloud of dust and debris, then lifted off again, now carrying a passenger. Lieutenant Nicks spent 3 years in exile, Hargrove explained as the helicopter approached the facility's landing pad. 3 years gathering evidence, building an unassailable case, and planning for this moment. Yesterday, she delivered that evidence to the appropriate authorities. Today, she demonstrated that legends are sometimes real, and that justice, however delayed, will always find its mark. The helicopter settled onto the landing pad adjacent to the command center, its rotors slowly winding down as Lieutenant Aviva Nicks emerged carrying her rifle case and a small pack containing 3 years' worth of carefully gathered evidence. She moved across the tarmac with the fluid economy of motion that marked elite operators, covering ground quickly despite the weight of her equipment, every step purposeful and controlled. Her uniform bore no insignia of rank, no unit patches, no indication of military affiliation beyond its basic design. General Hargrove stepped forward to greet her, coming to attention and rendering a crisp salute that she returned with equal precision. "Lieutenant Nicks. That was an impressive demonstration." "Thank you, sir," she replied, her voice clear and controlled despite the magnitude of what she had just accomplished. "Though I should note that conditions were nearly ideal. Light winds, excellent visibility, optimal temperature gradient. Under field conditions, the shot would have been significantly more challenging." "Don't diminish the achievement," Hargrove said with something approaching a smile. I've spoken with ballistics experts who insist that what you just did is mathematically impossible. No one else in this facility, no one else in this country, could have made that shot. As they spoke, the military police were placing Sergeant Major Blackwood in restraints. His earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the hollow-eyed expression of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. The files you provided have been thoroughly verified, Hargrove continued, turning to walk with Nicks toward the assembled trainees. Additional arrests are being made as we speak across 3 continents. The conspiracy that led to Operation Shadowfall has been completely exposed. For the first time since stepping off the helicopter, something like emotion flickered across Nicks' carefully controlled features. The others, she asked quietly, Rodriguez, Chen, Washington, Kowalski, Patel, their families have been informed. They received full briefings yesterday evening, Hargrove confirmed. The official records have been corrected. Their deaths have been properly attributed to enemy action rather than command failure. The families are being compensated accordingly, and arrangements are being made for proper recognition of their sacrifice. Nicks nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both satisfaction and continued sadness. That was the important part. Everything else is just details. But General Hargrove had other plans. Actually, Lieutenant, I should say, Lieutenant Colonel Nicks, there are a few more details to address. Her eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of a promotion she hadn't expected. Sir. Effective immediately, your rank, decorations, and security clearances are fully reinstated, Hargrove announced, removing a velvet case from his aide's hands. Furthermore, by order of the President of the United States, you are hereby awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. As he pinned the medal to her uniform, the assembled trainees rose as one in a spontaneous standing ovation. The sound echoed across the training ground, a recognition of courage and skill that transcended the normal boundaries of military protocol. When the applause finally died down, General Hargrove stepped aside, gesturing for Nicks to address the trainees. She approached the group with obvious reluctance, clearly more comfortable with actions than words. I didn't come back for this, she said simply, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. I didn't come back for reinstatement, or promotion, or recognition. I came back because 3 years ago, I made a promise to 5 operators who didn't return from what should have been a routine mission. She looked across the group, making eye contact with several of the trainees. I promised them that the truth would come out. That their families would know they died with honor, not because of negligence or betrayal by their commanding officer. That their sacrifice would be properly acknowledged and remembered. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. The lesson here isn't about marksmanship. It's not about making impossible shots or pushing beyond theoretical limits. It's about integrity. It's about standing by your team, no matter what, even when they're gone, even when the entire system turns against you, even when doing the right thing costs you everything you've worked for. She paused, her gaze moving across the faces of the young soldiers before her. Some of you will face moments in your careers where you'll have to choose between what's easy and what's right. Between protecting your career and protecting your people. Between accepting comfortable lies and fighting for difficult truths. Specialist Merrick raised his hand slightly. Ma'am, how did you maintain your skills during the 3 years you were away? A ghost of a smile crossed Nick's face. I worked security consultation for allied nations who didn't particularly care about my status with the US military. Turns out that when you're branded a failure by your own country, other governments are quite interested in hiring you. Their loss became someone else's gain. Another trainee asked, the shot today, at 3,500 meters, how much of that was skill versus calculation versus luck? All shooting is calculation, she replied without hesitation. The difference between good marksmen and exceptional ones is how many variables you account for. Most snipers consider wind, elevation, and distance. I was trained to factor in temperature gradients, barometric pressure variations, the Coriolis effect from Earth's rotation, even the spin drift of the bullet over extreme distances. She gestured toward the shattered remains of the target. But calculation means nothing without purpose. I didn't make that shot to prove anything about marksmanship. I made it to prove that some promises are worth keeping, no matter how long it takes. The formal ceremony transitioned into something more personal as General Hargrove opened the floor for additional questions. It was a rare opportunity for direct engagement between elite trainees and a living legend whose story had, until this morning, been classified at the highest levels. Lieutenant Colonel, one of the Navy SEALs asked, during Operation Shadowfall, when you realized it was an ambush, what kept you fighting when you could have escaped? Nicks was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focusing on something far beyond the desert horizon. You don't abandon your people. Ever. Even when the mission is compromised, even when the odds are impossible, even when survival seems unlikely. Rodriguez took 2 rounds meant for me. Chen held a choke point for 8 minutes against superior numbers so the rest of us could attempt to reach the extraction point. Washington carried Kowalski for over a kilometer after he was wounded, refusing to leave him behind even though it slowed our movement. Her voice grew softer, more personal. They died not because they failed, but because someone sold them out. For 3 years, I carried that weight, believing that somehow I had failed them as a leader. Learning the truth didn't make their deaths any easier to bear, but it allowed me to honor their sacrifice properly. Captain Reyes, who had been standing silently under guard during the ceremony, suddenly spoke up. You want to talk about honor? You want to talk about sacrifice? What about the intelligence that operation provided? What about the strategic advantage gained from? Silence, General Hargrove commanded sharply. Captain Reyes, you are under military arrest for conspiracy, treason, and accessory to murder. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court-martial proceedings. But Nicks held up her hand. Let him finish, sir. I'd like to hear his justification. Reyes looked around at the assembled soldiers, perhaps seeking support or understanding. Operation Shadowfall wasn't just an extraction mission. Those hostages we were supposedly rescuing were actually high-value intelligence assets. The mission was cover for something larger, a multi-year operation to penetrate foreign military structures. So you sold out 5 American soldiers to protect a spy network? Nicks asked, her voice deadly calm. I saved dozens of other operations. Hundreds of other lives. Sometimes commanders have to make hard choices about acceptable losses. The silence that followed was broken by Specialist Merrick's voice, tight with barely controlled anger. My brother was on that team. Staff Sergeant Elijah Merrick, call sign Raptor. You're telling me his life was an acceptable loss for your grand strategy? Recognition flashed in Nick's eyes as she looked at Merrick with new understanding. You're Elijah's younger brother. He talked about you constantly. Said you were going to be a better soldier than he ever was. Merrick's composure cracked slightly. He was supposed to come home after that deployment. He was supposed to meet his nephew. My son was born 2 weeks after the mission. Nicks reached into her pocket and withdrew a worn challenge coin, placing it carefully in Merrick's palm. He gave this to me the day I took command of the team. Said it was his lucky charm, and that I should carry it until we all came home safe. I've carried it every day for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to return it to his family. The emotional weight of the moment was broken by the arrival of another helicopter, this one carrying members of the Army Criminal Investigation Division and additional military police officers. The investigation into the Shadowfall conspiracy was moving into its operational phase. General Hargrove checked his watch and addressed the assembled trainees. Gentlemen, today's training exercise has obviously been somewhat unconventional. You've witnessed history in the making, not just an impossible shot, but the resolution of one of the most significant cases of military treason in recent decades. He paused, ensuring he had everyone's attention. The events you've witnessed today are classified at the highest levels. You will not discuss them with unauthorized personnel. You will not post about them on social media. The official story is that today's training was cancelled due to equipment malfunction. However, He continued, I want you to remember what Lieutenant Colonel Nicks told you about integrity and loyalty. Those lessons are not classified. They are the foundation of military service, and they will serve you well throughout your careers. As the formal proceedings wound down, Nicks found herself approached by several of the trainees individually. They asked about training techniques, about maintaining skills under adverse conditions, about the psychological challenges of long-range precision shooting. But the most significant conversation was with General Hargrove himself, conducted away from the others as the investigation team processed the scene. The paperwork is complete, Hargrove said quietly. Full reinstatement, backdated 3 years. Promotion to lieutenant colonel, also backdated. The President has asked me to convey his personal apologies and to inquire whether you would consider returning to active duty. Nicks looked across the training facility, watching as the next generation of elite marksmen prepared for challenges they couldn't yet imagine. What capacity? Your choice. Command of the Advanced Sniper School. Special Operations Planning. Even a staff position developing new training protocols. Your experiences, both operational and afterward, give you a unique perspective that we need. She was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Those trainees deserve better preparation than what the current system provides. Better leadership. Better understanding of what they'll face in the field. Is that a yes? That's a yes to rebuilding this program from the ground up. New protocols, new standards, new emphasis on the things that actually matter when the shooting starts. Hargrove nodded approvingly. You'll have complete autonomy and whatever resources you need. He paused, then added, there's one more thing. The families of your Shadowfall team members have requested to speak with you. They're standing by on secure video conference in the command center whenever you're ready. For the first time that day, Nick's emotional control wavered visibly. I've been preparing for that conversation for 3 years. I'm not sure I'm ready, but I owe them the truth. The command center had been cleared of all personnel except for General Hargrove's most trusted aides. On 5 large screens were the faces of families who had waited 3 years for answers, spouses, parents, children who barely remembered their father or mother. When Nicks entered and stood at attention before them, the room fell completely silent. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. and Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Washington, Mr. Kowalski, Mrs. Patel, she began, greeting each family formally. I owe you an explanation that's 3 years overdue. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose husband had been Nick's second-in-command, leaned toward her camera. Lieutenant Colonel, Marcus always said you were the finest officer he'd ever served under. We never believed the official story. Not for a moment. One by one, the families expressed similar sentiments, grief that had been compounded by official lies, relief at finally learning the truth, gratitude that someone had cared enough to fight for justice even when it seemed impossible. The conversation lasted over an hour, with Nicks providing details about each operator's final actions, their courage under impossible circumstances, their dedication to the mission and to each other. She answered questions about their final moments, shared personal messages they had asked her to relay if anything happened to them, and provided the kind of closure that only comes from absolute truth. When the conference ended, Nicks remained in her chair, emotionally drained but somehow lighter than she had felt in years. The Kadara facility had been renamed the Shadowfall Memorial Training Center, and Lieutenant Colonel Aviva Nicks' restructured program had quickly gained a reputation as the most rigorous and innovative sniper training in the military. The impossible target that had once stood at 3,500 meters had been replaced by 5 steel plates arranged in a semicircle, each bearing the name, rank, and call sign of a fallen Shadowfall operator. Hitting any one of these targets had become the final qualification requirement for program completion, a standard that honored the dead while challenging the living. On this particular morning, Nicks stood before her newest class of trainees, the rising sun casting long shadows across the training ground that had witnessed her moment of vindication a year earlier. Distance isn't just about physics, she explained, pacing slowly before the assembled marksmen. It's about patience, about reading the world between you and your objective, about understanding that sometimes the most important targets aren't the farthest away, they're the ones hiding in plain sight. She gestured toward the memorial targets that bore her teammates' names. Yesterday, 3 of you successfully completed the qualification shot. That's the highest success rate in any single class since we established the new standards. The others will have another opportunity next week. Captain Merrick, who had received his promotion and appointment as Nick's second-in-command 6 months earlier, joined her at the front of the group. Today, we're adding a new variable to your training. Variable winds at multiple elevations. The flags positioned across the range will give you surface indications, but you'll need to calculate variations at different altitudes. As the trainees moved to their assigned positions, Nicks walked alone to the ridge where she had made her impossible shot. It had become her daily ritual, a few minutes of solitude to remember the fallen and to prepare for the work of training their successors. 5 small memorial stones now marked the spot, each bearing the name of a Shadowfall operator. She placed a single rifle cartridge on each stone, a sniper's tribute to fallen comrades. "We kept the promise," she said quietly, addressing the markers as if the men they represented could hear her. Justice found its mark. Their families know the truth. And every marksman who graduates from this program will know their story. A young recruit approached hesitantly, clearly nervous about interrupting the commander's private moment. "Lieutenant Colonel Nicks. Permission to ask a question, ma'am." Nicks turned, recognizing the same hunger for excellence that had once driven her. "Granted. Is it true what they say about the shot you made from this position? 3,500 meters with a single round?" Nicks looked back toward the training facility, where the memorial target stood in silent testimony to the cost of military service. "The distance doesn't matter, soldier. What matters is understanding why you're taking the shot, who you're taking it for, and what you're willing to sacrifice to ensure it finds its mark." She looked back at the young recruit. Some targets are worth waiting years to engage. Some promises are worth a lifetime to keep. And sometimes, justice travels farther and hits harder than physics says is possible. The recruit nodded seriously, absorbing the lesson. "Ma'am, how do you know when a target is worth that kind of commitment?" Nicks smiled slightly, remembering a conversation from years past. "When it's not about you anymore. When it's about the people who trusted you, the people who died believing in you, and the people who will come after you." She gestured toward the training facility. "Now get down there and show me you understand the difference between shooting and soldiering. Captain Merrick has a challenging day planned for all of you." As the recruit hurried away, Nicks remained by the memorial stones, watching the new generation of elite marksmen prepare for challenges they couldn't yet imagine. The wind picked up slightly, and without conscious thought, she noted its direction and velocity, a sniper's instinct that would never fade. But for the first time in years, the weight of the past felt manageable. Justice had been served. Truth had been revealed. And somewhere in the distance, barely visible against the mountainside, 5 steel targets bearing 5 honored names stood ready to test the next group of warriors who would carry on their legacy. Lieutenant Colonel Aviva Nicks never sought fame or recognition. She never asked to become a legend. She simply carried the memory of 5 fallen soldiers in silence until the day she could set the record straight and ensure they were never forgotten. Because that's what real legends do. They don't demand to be remembered. They make sure others are never forgotten. Have you ever met someone who stands by their principles no matter the cost? Someone who fights for truth even when the whole world seems against them? Share their story in the comments below. Every community needs its quiet heroes. Thank you for watching Silent Legends. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us honor those who were never meant to be forgotten. Disclaimer. This video is a fictional narrative created for emotional, inspirational, and entertainment purposes only. The characters, events, and situations portrayed are entirely imaginary and should not be interpreted as factual representations of real-life individuals or events. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or real situations is purely coincidental. This content is not intended to offend, deceive, or cause harm. Viewer discretion is advised.